The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. I am coming to you from Las Vegas, Nevada at the Mass Towards Made Perfect conference. I tend to broadcast from this conference roughly every 6 months, and I'll have maybe some stories for you tomorrow. I have a really interesting story for you today about a new study which suggests that too much exercise can increase your risk of death. Now, the headline is very, very clickbaity, which is "You can exercise yourself to death," says a new study. What the study revealed is that white men who work out at least 7.5 hours a week are nearly twice as likely to suffer from heart disease as those who do a moderate amount, according to a new study. And researchers in Chicago compared 25-year exercise patterns, and they discovered that very active white men are 86% more likely to experience a buildup of plaque in the heart arteries by middle age compared to white men who do moderate exercise. But interestingly, the same phenomena didn't apply to black men. Black men who are very active don't seem to have an increased risk of death compared to moderately active black men. So what is the suggestion? The suggestion is that high levels of exercise cause stress on the arteries, which leads to coronary artery calcification. But the solution is not to stop exercising. It's maybe to exercise more moderately. This is actually a really worrying study, Pat, because so often when you hear headlines like this, people won't look at the details and they might take action that is actually even worse, like saying, I'm going to now live a sedentary life because it seems a lot of exercise is bad, just as
Right.
one example.
Well, I think it makes sense at some level because when we talk about exercise, you don't want to overexert yourself. So, we think about weightlifters. You really shouldn't be going to failure all the time or maxing out. And then we think about maybe distance runners that can wear at your joints after a long period of time. So I think it does make sense. Now, how it relates to, your heart health and your longevity, that's a stretch that I don't understand so much.
I used to have this idea that I would run a 5K every once in a while, and maybe I'd work up to a 10K or something like that, and maybe do more distance running. But the more I learn about it, the more I read about it, it appears as though really running more than a couple of miles at a time, a few times a week, is not particularly healthy for a number of different elements of human health. And sometimes it's a fallacy to say everything in moderation. Like there are times where when you say everything in moderation, when it comes to I don't know, there's times where everything in moderation is sort of logically fallacious, but with exercise it really does seem that different types of exercise are good because they don't allow the body to sort of become accustomed to a particular type of exercise, and that's a good thing in terms of developing flexibility, muscle endurance, tone, whatever. But also that not going to the extremes is also a good thing. And the one thing I'm not really understanding here is the explanation for the difference between black and white men. For whatever reason, the more extreme exercise for black men did not appear to create an increased risk of death. And it appears as though what the study says is that element requires further investigation. And I don't know about you, Pat, but I find that part pretty interesting.
Yeah, no guesses as to why this would disproportionately affect white men versus black men. I don't think it's a causation study, but I think it could also have to do with the nutrition side of things because if you think about, weightlifters, for example, oftentimes they'll go home after a workout and have a lot of protein. So they may have meals like, chicken and steak and foods that are often also high in cholesterol, and that can, over time, clog your arteries and lead to things like heart disease.
So that's interesting because there could be a causation correlation thing here, which is it appears that in white men, more extreme exercise is correlated with more heart disease, and in black men, it is not. Now, here's just one idea I'm coming up with. On average, economically, white men in the U.S. are better off than black men. I wonder if white men who are doing the extreme exercise are more able to afford whatever kind of, I don't know that I want to call it an extreme diet, but we could certainly call it, what word am I looking for?
I mean, even
not a weight builder's diet, but
even those protein supplements can be quite expensive. I mean, you get a tub of that whey protein and it could be like $40. I mean, that's an expense that not everyone can make.
Maybe that's the idea, which is that you would see the same medical outcomes in the white and black men were it not for diminished ability to afford some of these expensive products that maybe white men are using for their workouts. I don't know. I'm just speculating, but I think there might be something to that. Okay, let's talk about safety for women in different megacities. Cairo, Egypt has been determined to be the most dangerous megacity for women currently in the world, while London is the safest megacity for women, according to the first international experts poll on how women do in cities with over 10 million people. So 10 million is generally the cutoff for being considered a megacity. And the Thomson Reuters Foundation survey asked experts in women's issues in 19 megacities how well women are protected from sexual violence, harmful cultural practices, whether they have good access to healthcare, finance, and education. And Cairo, which is Egypt is the most populous country in the Arab world. Cairo is the capital of that country. They did the worst globally, followed by Karachi, Pakistan, and Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, followed by the Indian capital of New Delhi. London was the most woman-friendly megacity, followed by Tokyo and then Paris. Surprised by these numbers, Pat? When I saw these rankings, I found myself not surprised whatsoever.
Well, I think if it had to do a bit more with the subjugation of women that these countries were being ranked, I would expect to see maybe Saudi Arabia and Iran, cities within those countries, at the top of the list. But because it has to do with sexual violence specifically, I can see why Cairo would rank at the top. There's actually been a prevalence of rapes at protests and festivals that I was reading into. So not too surprising, and you can understand why a more enlightened city with more education, particularly on these issues like London, would rank at the top of the list.
Also, not ranking at the top, but particularly within sexual harassment, Sao Paulo, Brazil, not good. And I actually know a number of people who lived and a couple that still do live in Sao Paulo. And they say that what happens on the subways when it comes to sexual harassment of women is absolutely horrifying, just absolutely and totally horrifying. I think the study is interesting, but I am always thinking of solutions. Once we have this data, what could be done? And that's a much more difficult thing because it requires both political will, it requires cultural openness, and it also requires the finances in many cases to make significant changes. So I'm curious to see what ultimately are the recommendations for action items that could take place here. But those are the results. Yeah.
The death penalty is actually on the table for rape in Egypt as well, and it's usually applied for the most egregious cases, like when the victims are children, for example. But you'd think that would be a strong deterrent from sexual violence within the country, but we see that's just clearly not the case. So we know that it has more to do with enlightenment, education, just teaching people about how to respect women and move away from fundamentalist religions, I think.
Absolutely. I think it was you, Pat, who on Monday said something about these ideas of re-greening the planet. What was the word you used? I don't remember now, like making the planet. We were talking about sucking carbon. Making it green again? Yeah, I guess that's what it was. There's a very interesting report from climate scientists about what it would take to counteract the destructive impact of oil burning worldwide. And it turns out that planting forests actually could be it could play a major role. And I've talked about how, for example, in Boston and sometimes at the city level, you have these rules where if you want to build a condo and you've got to knock down 2 mature trees, you have to replant 5 trees for each mature tree you knock down. And while that's a really good thing, in the short term, those small trees, those saplings, are not going to have nearly as much carbon sucking power as mature trees. But there is a report now which says that if you plant forests and you really take the planting of forests seriously, that you only need to grow or accelerate forest planting slightly to really counteract the impact of oil burning around the world, and that trees just soak up so much carbon dioxide that it actually is a really effective way, and that you could, if you better managed forest I guess forestation would be the word, the planting of forests, you could avert over 11 billion tons of carbon dioxide emission by 2030. And that's equivalent to China's current carbon dioxide emissions from all fossil fuel use. So I guess, was I a little too cynical on Monday, Pat, about the possible impact, the positive impact of reforestation?
Well, I would have been just as cynical too, I think, because it seems so incredibly obvious. We don't think that solutions to big problems like these can be as simple as just planting some trees, especially because it's not too costly. I mean, sure, you have to send people out to plant them, but then nature takes over, and 37%, that gets you over a third of the way there,
Yeah. And that, I think, is, every time we talk about this, I become sort of overwhelmed by the numbers, where we're working so hard merely to reduce the rate at which we are damaging the planet. And we seem to be so far from serious conversations about how to actually start undoing damage. And of course, there's different opinions from climate scientists and other scientific experts as to what elements of climate change and human pollution can be undone and which are we just sort of going to have to live with. I do think, and we've talked a little bit about this, there are interesting developments in sort of re-ozoning, re-stimulating development of ozone, in reflecting some heat away from the planet, in taking advantage of using oceans to our advantage, all of these different ideas. My main skepticism right now, Pat, is that with 2- and 4-year political terms, in the United States anyway, and varying political terms in other parts of the world, I know that we should all really care about this, because even after you're no longer an elected official, you still have to live on this planet. But our political system doesn't really encourage any kind of long-term thinking. And with climate change, we're usually talking long-term.
I think it depends on the politician, though, because I think some are very mindful of the world that they're going to leave behind to their children, and also very mindful of their legacy. So I think Barack Obama was very big on his legacy and felt this way. Then you also have people like Donald Trump who just don't care, or maybe there's a younger, older divide too, where the effects of climate change aren't going to necessarily impact someone who's in their 70s and 80s versus someone who's in their teens and 20s and 30s. So I can see that being a factor as well.
This is really the issue where I know that there are some opportunities to make money from the green and alternative energy industry. It's just really depressing that I'm hoping that it becomes really profitable to save the planet, because I think that that's really the way that we are going to get people more interested in actually trying to fix this horrible problem that we're dealing with. Okay, that does it for today's bonus show. I will be here in Las Vegas tomorrow. Hopefully we'll have some stories for you on the bonus program about what happens at the conference today. There's going to be some very, very interesting panels and talks going on starting tomorrow. So I will get back to you on all of those things, and we will have a regular full program tomorrow as well.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.